Yeah, there's a little picture of me sitting there completely absorbed in something or other. I was lucky that my parents also bought me many books, beautiful books, and they put a lot of thought into it because they considered that, and quite rightly, very important. I don't have most of them anymore, but fortunately I kept a very small stash. So I'll just show you what I had and what I liked. And this was an encyclopedia written for children. I just gobbled it up. I read the pages again and again, and it went by the alphabet, and here you can see entries for the letter F, covering a variety of things like certain animals, photography, which starts with an F in German. I just couldn't get enough of it, and it sort of it forged a tendency in me that just continued over the years. So I just seem to vacuum up information as long as it's presented in an interesting way, and it certainly was here with the pictures and written in a suitable style for children. Yeah, that's me. I love that sort of stuff. One very influential children's book, I don't know whether anybody still knows this, and I'm not sure what it's called in English. I think it might be called something like Shaggy Pete, but that sounds a bit odd. Anyway, this book dates back to the first half of the 19th century, so it's very, very old. But it's been an enduring traditional book that all parents give to their children. It's just what was done. And, habit is a big thing in human civilization. This was really a series of moral or moralistic tales describing what happened to children who didn't conform, who didn't do as they were told, and accordingly suffered a gruesome fate. So here we have Scissorman. Now this haunted me for many years. You can see he's snipping the poor little boy's fingers off just because the boy was labelled a thumb sucker. He was sucking his thumb all the time, and I remember that was a big thing, as under the age of 6. You can see that once as a small child, if you have read a story like this, it would stay with you. And I guess when people say, oh, do you really like these stories and visual novels that have all these dark elements and violence and gruesome stuff in them, I can only think, yes, I was brought up with this, They're part of human life. We seem to enjoy having that, those two extremes, the good, the very good, and the very bad, and we're constantly trying to negotiate our way between them. I think this is a very, very interesting influence. In fact, this book is nowadays considered to be an early precursor to comic books, and you can see why. So, a bit of interesting history there. I had a book about a hedgehog called Latte, and another book I loved and read so many times. And what I really, really liked in those books was the illustrations. The thing here with a story about, I think, an Indian or Eskimo boy. Once again, the illustrations really make it come alive. And that book reflects an early interest I had in tribal cultures. And I did go on to study social anthropology at university. By far the biggest influence on me would have been books about fairy tales, legends, mythology. And there was a lot of that in Germany. For obvious reasons, the Grimm brothers reigned supreme. Their collection of fairy tales is, of course, famous worldwide. And once again, I just loved reading them, and I loved the illustrations with them. This one here is called Snow White and Rose Red. Here's a book about a giant. It's set in they're called the Giant Mountains, not surprisingly. They're set sort of between Poland and Czechoslovakia. And there's a set of folk tales about this giant. And that was very exciting and fascinating. So once again, wonderful illustrations. And the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen and his fairy tales. They're, of course, very well known, and I loved them as well. And gosh, did I study those illustrations. There's a reason why I'm showing you all these books. Here's one I had. It was a compilation written and edited specifically for children, but very comprehensive, very good, about all the Greek myths. The complete Greek mythology is in here. And I don't know how many times I read this. I mean, maybe a dozen times. I just went back and read more and more. Again, very striking illustrations. All these legends, fairy tales, myths have, of course, one thing in common. They're often full of violence. Horrible things happen. Astonishingly, this was all considered very suitable reading for children in Germany. And in a way, I'm glad. While I was sometimes a bit sort of freaked out or frightened by some of the stories, in the end, it's a way of confronting these things early. And we were given editions that, had been edited to make them suitable for children, but without really obliterating the core of what the stories were about. Other classics of literature were also popular. For example, the novels of Charles Dickens were considered essential reading for children in Germany. I was brought up on Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and Great Expectations. So by the time I got into high school, I already had a great repertoire of what we would call the classics in literature. And the great thing is, when you start early, you develop a real appetite for it. Apart from that, I was addicted to anything about adventure. Pirates. I loved pirates, the adventure. So this is obviously a Mutiny on the Bounty. I read that many times. I adored the swashbuckling pirate movies. Kirk Douglas. Oh my goodness. And of course they were big in the 1950s, and they were shown for many, many years in cinemas and on German TV, very popular. But my favourite pirate movie of all times is one about the real life Anne Bonny, and it's called Anne of the Indies. Now, I know this has got the German title on it. I could only get a German edition, but it has English on it. And that's Anne of the Indies with the absolutely wonderful Jean Peters in the main role. I adore this movie. Best pirate movie, especially for women, in my opinion. Oh, and I forgot to mention one other set of classic books from American literature that had a huge influence on me and again were considered very suitable reading for younger children in Germany, and that was Huckleberry Finn and Uncle Tom's Cabin. It had a huge impact on me. I remember crying every time I got to the end of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Just wonderful. So from all I've told you so far, I think you can see how all those things, while very old-fashioned, formed my tastes and allowed me to appreciate other forms of media, art forms, that had a similar approach. You can see how I loved drawings and illustrations in books, and that naturally led to me appreciating things like the art books that come with limited editions that I always show in my unboxings. I imagine that's where my interest and appreciation stems from. As you can see, no video games in my childhood, but plenty of other things that naturally fed into an interest for stories with pictures, motion pictures, and a particular type of story based on my early exposure to fairy tales, myths, and legends, which is a sort of natural breeding ground for role-playing games, I imagine. One other form of media I haven't mentioned are comic books. Comic books were once again looked upon with a bit of suspicion by many parents, especially if they were foreign ones, like American ones. Unfortunately, my parents were also a bit in that particular camp. Why, I don't know. We were allowed the odd one. There were some German ones. One I remember called Fix and Fox, and they were pretty popular. But there was the lure of the different. I had the good fortune of having a friend called Dagmar. Now, I've mentioned Dagmar in the other companion video. Dagmar had a huge stash of foreign comic books. Once a year, I was allowed to have a stack of those and read as much as I wanted over 24 hours, and then they had to leave the house again. Why this was such a strict rule, I cannot remember. And I remember sitting in bed for hours. I mean, I woke up early in the morning, so excited I wanted to start reading, and I had all these comic books, and I imagine there would have been Spider-Man and Superman in there. I can't remember most of them. They were all exciting to me. I just read them so quickly, it was like eating too much chocolate cake. But there is one title I remember, and in German it was called Prince Eisenherz, but in English it's called Prince Valiant. And I really liked that one, and for some reason, obviously, the name must have stuck in my long-term memory. Now, Prince Valiant is, of course, what we nowadays call medieval high fantasy, something like that. Maybe it's not fantasy, but it's very medieval. Sort of almost reminds me a bit of Fire Emblem or something like that. That to me is indicative that it must have influenced me to such a degree that when I was, for the first time, exposed to role-playing games set in that type of medieval setting and with fantasy components, that I just plugged straight in. I felt right at home. I thought, this is it. I found my home, really. So I find it really interesting how things that happened so many years ago still cast a very long shadow, in my case a very happy and fortunate shadow, into role-playing games. So I hope that's given you a bit of an idea about my background, how I see stories, how important they are to me, how there was probably a very natural progression from this sort of interest in books, stories, movies, television, into computer and video games. Now, how I got into video games, and that obviously happened much, much later, is a very different story, and it is quite a difficult one to tell and explain. And I have had so many inquiries, and I have promised people that I would one day make a video about how I discovered video games and how I got into them. I will do it. I can't promise when. Until then, I thank you very much for watching. It's been a pleasure. Keep well. I'm Food for Dogs. Bye-bye.